All right, so we are live. Welcome to the Bridge webinar series. I'm Rohit Mehta, a doctoral student in the Educational Psychology and Education Technology program at Michigan State University, and it is my distinct pleasure to be hosting today's episode. The Bridge is a production of the Masters in Education Technology program at MSU, and through this program, we aim to provide high-quality, free professional development for educators on issues of pressing importance in educational technology. If you're joining us for the first time, you can follow the live stream at bridge.educ.msu.edu. There, you will also find an open Titan pad where you can contribute to the conversation. You can also choose to tweet at us during the live stream, ask questions, using hashtag MAET Bridge. That is BRIDGE, MAET Bridge. That's our hashtag. Please join in the conversation and ask questions. I should also note that my co-host Spencer Greenhall will be here to support us and help us navigate and connect with the online conversation. And our other co-host and today's special on-field correspondent, Sarah Keenan, will be monitoring and encouraging the Twitter questions. Okay, so let's get started. The topic for this episode of this series is around the concept of open education. More broadly, we are interested in looking at the ideas of repurposing, reusing, and remixing existing resources in teaching. These materials and resources can range from written text to interactive media, but this is how far our understanding takes us. And obviously, we wish to learn more. So we thought, what can be a better way to answer our questions about open education than tapping in some of the experts we know? So joining us today are three of our most favorite people in the world: Dr. Lee Graves-Wolf, who is the Assistant Director at MSU Hub for Innovation in Learning and Technology, and before which she has also worked as the director of our very own MAET program for many, many years. Second, we have Dr. Jared Robinson, who is an education research consultant in the Office of Educator Talent and Policy Coordination at the Michigan Department of Education. His PhD research focused on the effects of OER textbooks on student learning outcomes. And finally, we have here joining us Jose Martinez, who is a graduate student here at the College of Education in the Curriculum, Instruction, and Teacher Education program. But I don't think I can do justice to their work, so let us move on to our guests and have them introduce themselves in better detail. Let's start with Jose. You've got the floor, Jose.
So hi, and thank you for the invitation. I am in my third year in the Curriculum, Instruction, and Teacher Education program. Before that, I was living in my home country, Colombia, and I was working both as a teacher and as an administrator, working with teachers at the K-12 level. And when I began my program here in the university of the university here and the side program at the College of Education, I came with a focus on language learning and teaching, bilingualism specifically, and now I'm combining both my interest in bilingualism and math teaching and learning. So the combination of those two things has led me to explore the learning of mathematics in elementary school, where kids communicate in more than one language. And because of that, I've become interested in using a series of resources that support teachers that do not always necessarily have access to those resources via their districts or their schools. But also I've been interested in the concept of authenticity and what authentic tasks are and what counts as authentic materials in this context, both in terms of language but also in terms of mathematics.
Thank you, Jose. Jared, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. So before coming to Michigan and starting my work at the Department of Education, I was a PhD student at Brigham Young University, where I joined the Open Education Group, which was led by David Wiley, John Hilton, with Lane Fisher as well. And there with the Open Education Group, we did a lot of research and implementation work around open educational resources as textbook replacement. So ways that teachers, both at the secondary and post-secondary level, could use open resources in the place of traditional publisher-produced textbooks to save schools or students money. And we studied how teachers and students perceive those open educational resources compared to some traditional textbooks. We studied cost savings associated with that. And then significantly, we spent a lot of time asking the question, what happens to learning outcomes when teachers make the choice to switch to open educational resources? Do students learn as much? Do they learn less, more? Do they persist in college better? What happens specifically to students on the student level when that switch is made? So we've done a lot of work in publishing that research and getting that out, and my dissertation focused on the effect of open educational resources at the post-secondary level.
Thank you, Jared. Lee?
Hi everyone, thanks for having me this afternoon. My name is Lee Graves Wolf, and as Rohit mentioned, for quite a long time I was the co-director of the Master of Arts in Educational Technology program, and that's really where I would say my interest flourished in open educational resources, specifically around Creative Commons. Our master's program is very project-based, and we would do our best to embed open educational resources into all of the projects that we would do in the program, and also trying to encourage students to share in that same way. I try in my own scholarship and the own work that I do to share and share alike. Even going as far as getting a Creative Commons tattoo on my foot to show that everything that I create is in the spirit of openness. Not in a silly way, though. I mean, that's just sort of a symbolic representation. But I've just personally been able to experience so many deep connections with others and with content by working in the open and sharing with others.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for letting us speak into your amazing world of education research and practice. And we obviously have a lot of questions for all of you. Let us start with research, and let's start with Jared. Jared, could you briefly talk about your work with the Open Education Group at Brigham Young University?
Yeah, so I mentioned some of the areas that we looked into, but we found a lot of interesting things over the time that I was there, and I know they're still doing really great work. So the first thing that I think is interesting is we were interested in finding out how people perceived, well, these resources, whether they thought they were as high quality as traditional publisher textbooks. And measuring quality is a tricky proposition. So our first attempts at looking at quality dealt with perceptions, and so we did wide-scale surveying of faculty and students, both who were involved with open educational resources at the post-secondary level, who were earlier adopters, 2011, 2012, and what we discovered is that even though sometimes visually, and this wasn't always the case, but visually those were a little bit simpler, the content was received extremely well by both the students in the course and the faculty who used them. Students perceived that the materials were professional and high quality, but also that that they were easy to access and really facilitated learning. And then we thought it was interesting that the faculty members really felt the same way. So that was encouraging to us. But we were interested, there are problems with perception research, so we were interested in looking at, well, what happens to student learning outcomes? And so we did that at the secondary level with a study that got published last year in Ed Researcher in October of 2014. You can find that, that's open access online. But we found that students did better on their state standardized test scores when their teachers switched to open educational resources for science in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. And that was an amazing finding that the learning outcomes actually increased. We did a quasi-experimental study. We did some propensity score matching to mimic random assignment, and we feel really confident that the OER actually helped learning outcomes in that case. In the post-secondary, we have a little bit of a mixed bag. We just barely published a study that showed increased learning outcomes, and we've seen no difference in other cases, and occasionally students didn't do as well as their peers. So, you know, I think what it really gave us a lot of confidence is that if you are willing to make the switch, you can do it without, at least without harming student outcomes. There's the potential to increase student outcomes, but really, you don't need to worry that that's going to be the thing to keep you away from adopting. But the other learning outcome that we saw that was just spectacular was that when college students save money on open textbooks, they use that money to enroll in more courses. And we didn't know if they were going to do that, but we see that repeated over and over again in our studies, that they actually are enrolling in more courses and using that money to pursue and further their education, which is a great finding, especially for our community college students, where enrollment intensity is so important.
Right. Well, thank you so much for setting the tone there. There are several threads that we want to take from here, and we can talk about teachers. We can also talk about the student outcomes, which Jared briefly talked about. But first, thanks, Jared. And my question is to Lee on a similar note, because you have been doing some research around this area as well, but even more so, you have integrated this approach in your own work. And my question is, how do you embed open scholarship into your work?
So my work, I'm going to more focus on the practitioner work I've done, or the teaching piece of things, because I'd say that's where I have the most time to embed. I wish I had more time to actually write it up and do the findings, but hopefully by sharing, people can use what I share and research on that. But so one of the principles of our program and how we define educational technology, and Punya Mishra has used this quite often as his definition of an educational technology, is that there's no such thing as an educational technology. It's a creative repurposing of a tool that then turns it into an educational technology. So using this basis of creative repurposing and working with the K-12 audience who is under financial constraints as well, doesn't have unlimited budgets, open educational resources, open resources are a natural fit to our curriculum. So I'll just give one specific example. A project we've been doing for quite a long time is called Reuse, Remix, Recycle. And we use the open video at archives.org. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of video out there. And so we send students to that resource for content. And this is the beginning of the project, is just to look at all of the examples of video out there. We give them an educational theory, and then they're tasked with, in a very short amount of time, called a quick-fire challenge, a short amount of time to take an educational theory, the existing video, and make a quick 2-minute video that encapsulates that theory. So the reason I like that project and use that as an example is that a lot of times if we're doing video with students, we might have them create their own video or make up some silly scenario for them to do, whereas this is using authentic materials that are already existing, repurposing, remix them, and giving them a whole range of experiences then in video editing and connection, but also then connection to the coursework itself. So that as a model sparks ideas for the teachers themselves that they can go back and then think of all of these tremendous resources, Library of Congress. Like once you start going down the rabbit hole of the high quality resources that are available, that are meant to be shared and remixed, you're working with a rich set of primary source resources that teachers in all of their different curriculums can then use that as a spark to integrate into their own teaching.
Well, thank you, Lee. And I love how it connects with what Jared said earlier about the idea of quality, but also what Jose mentioned about authenticity. and coming up with these different ideas for teachers. And I want to pull in Jose to talk more about the process of selecting and integrating these resources. So Jose, from a practitioner's point of view, think about a resource that you have been or you have used in your teaching, and how do you think a practitioner can go about selecting these resources, and what is your process of, and how do you then integrate these resources in your teaching? Jose?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Did you hear my question,
Okay.
though?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
So two examples that come to mind. One is from my work with pre-service teachers that are getting ready to teach mathematics at the elementary school level. And another example that it's my own work with undergraduates level students that are learning Spanish and are in this particular special language immersion program. So with the pre-service teachers, what I did was to try to look for certain alternatives of materials that the teachers could use with their students using technology. And what we ended up using was a series of open resources for free that can help the students construct different types of triangles, and the tool would take care of measuring the sides of the triangles and measuring the angles, so that when these pre-service teachers, if these pre-service teachers were to use this in a real classroom with elementary school students, they wouldn't have to worry about preparing materials such as cutting a bunch of triangles of different size and characteristics, and they wouldn't have to worry about the classroom management aspect of having to distribute and make sure that the students were using these triangles, but instead they could just use this online tool that was there for free. And the second thing that was interesting to see is that as part of the conversation of how these pre-service teachers could use this tool in the classroom, the idea of the cognitive demand of the task came up, and what we were figuring out is that by having this tool, then the kids in the real classroom wouldn't be worrying about measuring and about measuring either the sides of the triangles or the angles. They would be measuring about the real mathematic, they will be worrying about the real mathematic concept that we kept in mind, which was what's the relationship between the angles and the sides of the triangles. So in a way, by using this tool, we were both facilitating the teacher's planning, but we were also making sure that the students were going to be worrying and that their cognitive processing was going to be directed towards the analysis that we really wanted for them to be concentrating on, as opposed to worrying about the mechanics of measuring angles and distances. So in connecting that to authenticity, what both the students and I felt that was authentic about it was first that using this type of technologies, specifically using either a tablet or a computer, is something that felt more authentic, could potentially feel more authentic for the kids compared to using construction paper triangles. But it also felt authentic in terms of making sure that students were going to have access to this technology tool, as opposed to just having technology being used as something static that the teacher, again, only uses to present information. And the second part that was authentic about that task is that it's a more authentic representation of what mathematical activity is. So instead of thinking about mathematicians and mathematical endeavors as involving the mechanics of a procedure such as measuring an angle, the real authentic mathematics that we were trying to elicit there was students coming up with hypotheses about the relationships between different attributes of a geometric figure, and students trying to come up with different experiments to test those hypotheses, and that felt more authentic for us. And my second example comes from my own work with a group of undergraduate students who are part of a Spanish immersion program. And the tool, or one tool that we've used there, is LibriVox. And LibriVox is an online website that has this repository of audiobooks in a set of languages. These are for free. These are books that are, let's say, classics, so we don't have to worry about authorship and that kind of issue. And there are two ways in which I've used that in the past. One is by having students use the books there and look for certain books that might be connected to the topics that we are trying to address. So these are audiobooks that people have recorded, so the students have had access to a different set of Spanish accents besides mine.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that it's possible using this tool is to volunteer. So everybody can just select their favorite book, that it's an open resource, that it's a free book, and they can do or go through the process of recording chapters of that book, and that becomes a collaborative effort. So we've tried that, and we've tried to do what's manageable for us at different proficiency levels. So it could involve one student only recording a sentence, such as the titles of a chapter, whereas other students that might be more proficient can record other chunks of the chapter, and students who are even more proficient can record parts of the chapter that include not only speaking or reading, but that include conveying certain emotions and, so to speak, being more dramatic in the presentation, which is at the language acquisition process a more difficult thing to do. So we've been able to use that tool, the LibriVox site, as a tool for differentiating instruction.
Thank you so much, Jose, for sharing that funds of knowledge with us. And it makes me want to go back to Lee for a minute and ask it. So Jose shared some examples with pre-service teachers and his own work, and I was wondering if you had, do you think how similar or different this is with in-service teachers, because you work with in-service teachers a lot, and also in your work, if you notice something that you want to share with us.
I think that same enthusiasm and spirit is in service teachers. These resources are very new to a lot of people, so I think that you're seeing that same level of integration and excitement just because of the concept itself is new. It's not something that's been around for a long time. So I think that once that those doors are starting to open, or teachers are realizing, or some districts are starting to embrace at a larger level, these initiatives, you'll see that enthusiasm and those sparks continue to grow.
Right. So that actually, because of that, it makes me think of going back to Jared. Jared, you were talking about your research earlier. So what does your research suggest about open textbook adoption? Because that was something that you mentioned earlier, and we've talked about this. Suggest about open textbook adoption in secondary and post-secondary education.
You know, that's a great question, and thanks, Rohit. You know, I listened to Lee and Jose both talking about, you know, the really innovative pedagogical things that they're deciding to do, and really, that's one of the things I think is exciting about OERs, the chance to really expand beyond the textbook and beyond some of the more traditional ways of delivering material and content to students, and moving beyond our metaphors of delivery and content and some of those things as well. But if you're just going to look at sticking with the textbook and textbook replacement, we found some interesting things about the teachers who adopted, for example. So just the act of adopting open educational resources was a powerful professional development for the science teachers in the secondary environment who went through the process. You know, for such a long time in our classrooms, and that's my background as a classroom teacher as well, we have deprofessionalized our teachers as content matter experts by giving them textbooks and giving a prescribed order and content delivery vehicle for them. But when teachers in Nebo School District piloted these open text science textbooks in Utah, they were able to get together and align their textbooks with the curriculum and decide on sequencing and how they were going to sequence not just for 1 year, but line up their curriculum materials across years. That was really exciting. The other thing that we found is that they were able to have much more up-to-date content much quicker. You know, the reality is that you could buy a new set of textbooks every year, and they update them on a slow cycle, but they are getting updated. It takes a while for that information to filter down in, but no school district has the money to be replacing textbooks that often. And so, but with open textbooks, you can make an adjustment in the moment as knowledge changes and as new things come out. And the other thing that was really interesting is, you know, we found out that it wasn't just a one-to-one change. So it did change the way that they were teaching, in that instead of having a classroom set where students would have to only use a textbook in a classroom setting, and that would really limit how useful that was as a resource, having open resources meant that everyone had access to the resources both at home and at school. And so it went from teachers not using the textbook as a resource at all to having this be something that was powerful, where students were able to annotate, take notes on the text, and bring that with them going on in their academic career. So, you know, just a lot of powerful things, both for the teacher and for the student, in terms of open educational resources. You know, we found that's a powerful way for districts to save money, let alone all these other great things. But how is that for answering some of your question on that?
Great, but now I have another follow-up question for you. So we talked about this from teachers' point of views, and you briefly mentioned earlier about the learning outcome for students. And you said right now that it's good for both students and teachers. So I want to know more about what you feel, or what your research suggests about what students feel, or what students think about this in general, about open resources and use of open resources in their classrooms.
Right. Well, you know, interestingly, in this high school and middle school study that we did, students all got their own copies of this textbook. They were printed out for just at cost, at $4 a textbook. They were able to annotate, they were able to take notes and take their textbook with them. So students reported back that the textbook was actually an important part of their learning. You know, it was a record of their learning. But you know, at the end of the year, these students who had the open textbooks, they scored higher on their end-of-year state standardized tests at significant levels than their students who didn't use those open textbooks. And that was even controlling for things like how students performed in those same teachers' classes prior to those teachers adopting open educational resources, controlling for student prior learning and how students had done in prior years, and socioeconomic stats and these other things that we know affect learning, even controlling for all these things. That students' learning experience was improved in a measurable way. So, you know, that was really interesting. At the college level, man, I'll tell you what, students, when they don't have to buy a textbook, that is a gift to a student. You know, that you don't have to buy a textbook, that you still have access to high quality curriculum, and you don't have to buy a textbook. This is it's a welcome relief, anywhere ranging from welcome relief to a real game changer financially for these students who are struggling to make it. You know, it goes such a far way in democratizing education, and you know, we know that textbook cost has skyrocketed over 800% since the 1980s. That it has outpaced inflation and even outpaced some of the rise in tuition. So, you know, access to the information is a right in today's age, and shifting to open education resource models like Lee and Jose have done is so powerful in terms of expressing to students that that they're empowered and that there's not a barrier to their access, to their entrance into learning.
Right. But democratizing education. Thank you so much for giving us a taste of what research says about open education. Let's hear from Jose and Lee about what students feel, or what students' experiences are from a practitioner point of view. So let's start with Jose. Jose, how has the repurposing and remixing of certain resources has enhanced your students' learning experience?
Yeah, so I agree completely with Jared and Lee, and I think also that I would add that one component that would be missing from the learning experience if we weren't using these types of resources is the critical analysis of the tools that are there and the information that is out there. So by selecting certain resources and by looking at certain resources flexibly, students have been able to incorporate it not only with the specific teaching or learning that we are dealing with in whatever class I'm teaching, but it sort of becomes second nature. It sort of becomes a skill in itself, so that they can go on analyzing and looking at different resources and seeing how useful they could be in situations for which they perhaps were not designed for. That is the case with these technology tools that I was describing earlier. The other thing is the limits. The limits sort of get blurry. It stops existing, and things like geographical limits stop existing, and we get access to worldviews and to world experiences that if we were circumscribed by a textbook or by the resources that we could find in a classroom, we wouldn't have access to. And then the final thing that I can think of that to me is the most powerful one is that it has helped the students think about their learning experience from the point of view of resources as opposed to thinking from the point of view of the lack of access to those resources. So it's no longer about what they don't have or what limits there are for their access, but it's about what they do have and how they can use it to enhance their own experience.
Right. On that note, how has it enhanced your teaching experience?
I think that in a similar way, because again, going off of what Jared was saying, I no longer have to worry about budget. I don't really need to ask for money for many, many things. There's things that we can just do using these technology aspects. I also think that it, as my pre-service teacher said, I also think that it has facilitated my planning because it no longer depends. Again, I've been able to redirect my efforts, and instead of having to go hours cutting materials and pasting and doing that kind of stuff, I can dedicate that time and energy into thinking how to use a specific resource so that it matches the learning objective that I have. So it's no longer dedicating time to creating the resource, but to using the resource in more meaningful ways. And the last thing that I would say is that it has led me to become an active learner, because I no longer have a textbook or a curriculum that holds the authority in terms of what it is that I have to teach or how it is that my students are supposed to be learning. Now I have to think more creatively in terms of what I have there and the resources that I myself know.
Similar to what Jared was saying earlier. Thank you so much. And I'll extend this question to Lee because I want to hear what Lee has to say about building off of Jared and Jose's comments. So Lee, how do you think this affects students' learning experiences and your teaching experience?
Well, you can actually hear it from one of our students right now. She's participating in the hashtag, and that's what I'm just loving that is happening, because that it's not just me either. Or this community, this piece of openness allows these connections to happen. So Debbie, one of her tweets was that as a student, it's liberating to not have to worry about that textbook. And we as a program have just been operating for so long as that's just the norm. It's hard for me to think of what it would be like to teach from a textbook in and of itself. I think as a program, and you've experienced this too, Rohit, that we've been consuming this culture and all these materials, and we've taken it an interesting step next level. MSU has something called an espresso book machine, which is a democratizing technology. I believe it's very low cost to actually create printed materials. And we've found and seen something so powerful in the crowdsourcing and collaboration of creation of knowledge, teachers being creators of knowledge because they're in these areas where they're being told certain things and they're not honored as professionals, as Jared was saying. And we've had them create books and create that artifact, and it's wonderful to hear the research backing what you and we see in our students, not just our face-to-face students. We see, because we embed Twitter in these open, well, we can debate the openness of some technologies or not, but public technologies as well as open, we're able to see and reflect and what these technologies can bring in terms of connection. So it really does break down a wall and open up new levels of creativity and engagement as educators, because you do feel so powerful when you're creating and facilitating those experiences for students, which is inevitably, and it sounds like the research is proving, going to have tremendous ripple effects in student achievement, and that's a huge level of area of research that's extraordinarily exciting, because we can show the power of opening things up in the collaboration piece.
Right. And now this makes me think of we have three people from different backgrounds talking over the similar idea and sharing their views on it. And I'm thinking, like, Lee just gave a shout out to Debbie McCarney, who's out there tweeting. And it makes me think of, like, there are definitely other scholars and teachers who are doing similar kind of work. Let's start with Jared. Jared, how can we become connected with like-minded colleagues who can help us move toward more openness?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking that. You know, it's an important question, because the truth of the matter is there are forces that don't like open educational resources, and they have a lot of money sometimes and a lot of clout, and they have a traditional entrenched space in the learning environment, and so finding like-minded people and being able to connect to others who are engaged in this work is so important. And that's one of the other benefits of being involved in open education and seeking out open educational resources. It does connect you to a wide network of people who are doing such great work. You know, right now, I'm a little jealous that I'm not able to be in Vancouver, because there's Open Ed Conference 2015 is in Vancouver, British Columbia right now. But if someone were to go on and just look at the program for Open Ed 15, they would automatically be able to see a whole host of researchers and practitioners who are engaged in the same kind of work in the secondary space, in the post-secondary space, in the policy space. You know, it's interesting. That's one way, is to go to conferences. And Open Ed conference is one of 3 or 4 major conferences that really focus on open educational resources and bringing people together who are like-minded on that. You know, another way, Twitter. You know, there are a lot of really great people on Twitter that I like to follow. You know, Lee often is one that I like to see her things pop up on Open Ed, or you know, people like Creative Commons. Cable Green is a great ambassador for Creative Commons. Nicole Allen for Open Textbooks. You know, these are people to follow on Twitter, and they're constantly connecting people to open educational resources. And then, you know, another way is just by finding the repositories that are collecting some of these open educational resources. And there are hundreds, because over the past 5 and 10 years, there have been millions and millions of dollars invested in creating these by the Gates Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, Saylor Foundation, and many, many others. So looking on things like OpenStax has a whole list of post-secondary and even secondary textbooks available. CK12 is another resource. And then Saylor Foundation has a lot of K-12 resources, especially. There are way more repositories than these, but any time you find one of those repositories, you're also going to find a whole network of people who are doing the work and sharing out and eager to help. Eager to help anyone who's looking to get into this space.
Wow, if people, you are missing this webinar series, please go back to bridge.edu.msc.edu and watch all the resources that Jared just shared with us. Thank you so much. I'm also wondering if the resources that you just shared, are these a good way to get connected with or learn about the growing pool of research on OER as well? Or do you have more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. You know, the Open Ed group just barely has finished a literature review of some of the most important research on open education. So let's see. I just want to make sure I get the UL right here. If you go to openedgroup.org and you click on publications, you'll be able to see some of the list of articles and research that's been done by the group in particular, but then also there's a review project which goes ahead and it collects research from outside the group as well. Anyone who's done research in open educational resource efficacy in the learning space. And you know, that's not the only group that's collaborating this research. The OER Hub out of the UK has done a really good job of bringing together and of creating a central place to go to find out where OER has been implemented and what studies have been done academically. And OER research is really blossoming. It's a field that's getting more and more attention and more space. Much more so as more and more people are doing rigorous and interesting studies on it, and there's room for more. There's room for a lot more people in this space to be looking. There are lots of unanswered questions and lots of fun things to explore. So hopefully, you know, more and more people are intrigued by this and incorporating it into the research they're doing. Either teachers in the classroom doing action research on their own practice, and academics as well.
Right. I'm sure there's room for more people. After all, it's open. And a shout out to people who are watching. And so now you know where to go if you want to look at some of the research that backs up open education. But I think we have other two guests who also have or must have a ton of resources to share with you. And let's hear quickly, because we are kind of running out of time, but we have time to share resources. Lee, what are your thoughts on that? Who are some open scholars or conversations that you recommend following?
I was madly trying to find all the resources, so I need to go back and look at the archive. Fantastic. But one person I recommend, sometimes we tend to be U.S. scholar-centric in our circles, and Jared mentioned the UK. There's a ton of work happening in the UK and Australia on this as well, and Europe. So I'm sure, you know, there's all these different networks, and then that blasts it open even more. So one entry point into that is Catherine Cronin. She does a lot of work in the open space, and once you connect and follow her on Twitter, you'll see, and I think it's called OER 16. There's a big conference coming up in Edinburgh in the spring. I'll look it up and make sure to tweet that out. But that's another sort of hub of the researchers and the scholars and the practitioners outside of our U.S. circles that are in this. And the power of building these networks of open scholars, I'll tweet out as well shortly. Yesterday, put out a call for a maker education bibliography, an open Google Doc that will be a spot for scholars who are interested in just sharing and starting to build a bibliography of resources there. And after posting it, there's already a database growing of resources. So once you find this network, your work sort of blossoms and shares, and as a scholar and as a teacher, you don't feel alone. I think that Jose sort of mentioned this as well, the networks and the collaboration that you build, it's just absolutely invigorating as a teacher and a scholar.
Right. Thank you so much. We have more resources coming. At first, I started making a list of all the names that you guys were mentioning. I was like, there's no way I can track this down. So please go back and watch the video again and make a list of all the cool resources that are being shared here. And I'm sure, Jose, you have some recommendations on how to connect with other people or resources, or who to connect with.
So what I was thinking is that for me the process has been rather organic and just trying to go online and look for things that might be of my interest, but it also has been this process of being aware of what's around me and just in my free time or when I'm doing things that are not really connected to my teaching efforts, my mind naturally goes to seeing certain resources as things that I could potentially use in my teaching. And the other thing that I think has been powerful for me has been just being attentive to students, and it sort of becomes, it's this snowball effect, because as I suggest certain resources, then it is the students that respond with other recommendations of things that they are aware of that could well help us get the learning objectives that we have as well.
Oh, that is a great suggestion. So taking an organic approach to finding resources and keeping your students in mind. Thank you so much. I know we had a lot of questions, but I sure might have missed some. So before I start wrapping this up, I was thinking if there is something that you wanted to talk about and I did not get at. Anyone, just jump in.
Okay. I'm looking for all the resources.
I know. We're all thinking.
Yeah. I thought I'd just give pause for a moment because I've been talking continuously. So.
Lee and Jose said something that reminded me, though. I mean, it's the really great thing about this. Like Lee's project, for example, where students were remixing videos, is they were remixing these into open educational resources of their own and create. I mean, what you really do is when you get students remixing, in these kind of ways, students participate in an authentic moment where they join the community and create something that is open to be shared and used again. I think it just is powerful. It's powerful how we think about teaching and learning. It's powerful, how we think about our own communities of practice. And I tend to think in those terms. And it's inspiring to me to listen to the two of you talk about your practice. It reminds me of why I just think this is so important.
One side thing that just popped up, there's a great resource called Everything is a Remix. It came out a handful of years ago, I think from Creative Commons, and I just heard that it's in the midst of being revised and refreshed. So early next year that series will come out, and we use that sort of as an entry point into that. So I'm really looking forward to that resource being updated, and I'll dig that up and tweet that out as well. It's a great way if you're introducing the concept of open and remixing to students. One of the resources I use a lot.
Thank you. Thank you all for that exciting and informative discussion. But we are coming near an end, and before I continue, I want to just touch base with Spencer if we have any, because I see a lot of comments on Twitter. I don't know if you have any specific questions right now.
If it's not cheating, I do have a question of my own. So throughout this entire conversation, I've been thinking back to an experience I had when I was student teaching. Jared, you were talking about the difficulty that a lot of schools and districts have with purchasing up-to-date textbooks. And so I was doing my student teaching in a French classroom, and all of the prices of the goods in a particular textbook I was working with were in francs, which had been phased out 10 years earlier in the country. All of the prices were in euros now, and most of the textbooks had their prices in euros, but there were still some decade-old books in that classroom. And to connect that in with what Jose was saying, not only was that that wasn't just an openness problem, it was an authenticity problem, where if I wanted to teach something out of that chapter of the book, I was teaching it in a way that didn't really reflect the subject matter that I was talking about. And so that would have been a tremendous resource for me. I would have loved to be able to have an open textbook. But as I said, I was just a student teacher. And the real teacher in that class, the head teacher of the class, wonderful teacher, absolutely passionate about what she did. But she was already intimidated by PowerPoint, much less working with an open educational resource. So just One thing that I'd love to ask, just to all three of you really briefly, is what sort of skills does a teacher need to participate in this remix culture? And how does one acquire those skills?
That's a great question. I know all three of you might want to start or address that question. Jared, do you want to go first?
Well, yeah, I'll just speak, because at the entry level, you can just do one-to-one textbook replacement. And that takes, so many of us teachers are familiar with the textbook. It's how we grew up. So that doesn't take a lot of technological savvy. I mean, you don't have to be technologically savvy at all if you're just going to do a one-to-one replacement. Now, you don't get all the benefits of openness. You get some of the financial benefits and maybe more up-to-date information. But if that's the place to start, the research says that you can do that and kids aren't going to suffer and they'll even benefit. So that doesn't require a lot. I'll defer to Lee and Jose for some of the more innovative ways and whether the technology is a barrier for that.
Lee, what do you think?
I think, yeah, there's all different levels to anything. So there are easy ways to get going, and once you sort of get that comfort level, then that sort of steps up into other ways of either sharing back and participating, which usually involves some digital or technology skills associated with that. But entry-level feet wet piece, I'd say the barriers to entry are very low to just start out and get into it.
So, Jose, finally, in your experience, what do you think are some of the important skills to have?
So I think that first of all, I would say there's the need to have a certain attitude to approach one's own teaching, because it's taking the risk of going away from a textbook and going away from certain prescriptions of what to do and what not to do in the classroom. And even though it sounds obvious that it might sound obvious that there are certain advantages to going for open resources, I think that curiosity and that openness, it's not always there. So I would say that attitude is necessary. The second thing that I would say is that in terms of technology use, there might be different entry points, as Lee and Jared were mentioning before. So one of the things that I am using includes the LibriVox example that I was giving includes looking for the audiobooks online, but also having my students record and then edit and then uploading, so that can involve more steps. And if a person is not comfortable with that, then the other example that I was giving, just using an online site, that's all it takes. You just open the site and then the students are going to use it. But Spencer's comment and Spencer's question makes me think about teacher preparation as well, and it makes me think about what we instructors, faculty and graduate students that are instructors at pre-service teacher preparation programs, I think we have a big responsibility in making sure that our students are able to look for these resources and that they feel comfortable using those resources. So I think that it's a shared responsibility. It's not just about what teachers do or what teachers cannot do, but it's also about how we can prepare these teachers to feel more comfortable.
And if I can add one additional piece of that, the culture piece really resonated, and that's one of the hardest, that's the most difficult thing. The technology piece is easy, but the culture is hard. And if we as teacher educators, and I've faced this in the post-service or in-service teacher training, we get people really excited to use these resources, and then they'll go back to their schools and their environments or go into a new environment where there's a lot of resistance. So how can we also, in addition to the technology tools, help equip leaders and future leaders in this area with the dispositions and the resiliency and the knowledge to advocate for this type of work?
Makes perfect sense. And it makes me think of how important it is to be able to navigate on the web and find information, find authentic sources, and of course, selfishly gonna plug literacies there. So thank you all for that informative discussion and sharing all these resources, but none of our sessions are complete without asking our guests, what do you love about your work? So we'll go around, take a minute or two to share with our viewers what you love about your work. So let's start with Lee.
That was less than a minute. No, I love working. I love things like this, and I love the great thing about working openly and collaboratively is you'll never know when at a moment something will come your way, whether it be a tweet or a message or an email, or you'll see a student's work cited somewhere, and that's what I love the most about the work that I do, is being able to work with people and to see great ideas and great people flourish and grow and influence others in ways that are hard to define.
Thank you. Jose?
Yeah, I think that it's similar to me, and I would mention two things that are connected. One is the sense of surprise, not being able to always anticipate what my day is going to look like and what's going to happen, because it's going to depend on the ideas that in the classroom we're going to share, and those discussions and those conversations can be planned to a certain extent, but after that it's just in the interaction in that specific moment, and being surprised and being able to witness surprise by my students. That's something that I really, really enjoy. And the second thing that it's sort of connected with it is just human connection, being able to interact with others, having access to others' ideas and life stories, and being able to recognize how each one of us is a complete whole universe.
Thank you. And finally, Jared, what do you love about your work?
Well, having been out of the classroom for 5 years now, it makes me miss that. Hearing you talk about the experiences that you're having makes me a little sad. But one of the things I like about being in the government sphere is the chance to bring the experience that I had as a classroom teacher and as a researcher and an academic to these different conversations that people are having on such a wide array of topics, and to be able to have a voice in some of those discussions. I also am just so impressed with people who care about education and who care about learning and kids. And I'm in the P12 space now, but there are just so many people who care so deeply and passionately about this. And I think it's a gift to work with people in the education sphere. I think it's a really nice place to be, and I'm reminded of that every day.
Thank you so much. And that's all for today. And you heard it, people. It's about authenticity, liberation, democratization, and more. So if you missed the webinar, please watch the recording on bridge.edu.c.msu.edu, and we'll see you next semester. Thank you.